So now we want to add a game history feature. Now this one's going to be a bit more complicated, and if it goes over your head a little bit, that's okay. I promise it'll click for you eventually, but I wanted to run you through this to show you some of the capabilities that we have with the way that we have built this. So what are we talking about here? Well, if we go to this extra credit page, then we'll see we have a game history feature. So if I come around here and I'm like, oh no, I meant to go somewhere else. And yeah, there I go. Ta-da! Now I can do whatever I want, and I'm the winner now. Hooray! So that's the idea behind the history feature. We can go to any step in our game, and the board will just render whatever the current squares are. So we need to maintain some state to know which step we're currently on. We need to maintain state to know what squares are represented by that step. And then everything else is just the same. To make this work, we're going to restructure things a little bit, and our friend Marty the Moneybag gave us some code for the game. So we're going to move lots of the stuff from the board to the game component. So let's copy and paste this right there. And now we're rendering the board with the onClick handler for select square and the current squares. And now the game is responsible for rendering the restart button. It renders the status, and it also renders the moves. So we're going to comment out the moves because we don't have those, but the rest of these we can grab from our board. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to grab restart, select square, and our state from the board. And now the board is going to get an on click, which is what we're going to use when a button is clicked. And we're also going to get these squares. And we're no longer going to be managing the status or the reset button. Great. So then let's paste all this stuff in here. And instead of current squares, we're just going to say squares. Cool. So let's go back to our board. We'll hit save. And now things have been restructured a little bit. Awesome. So as I prefer, I like to get the UI set up before I start adding interactivity and state management. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a history array here, and it's going to be an array of arrays. So I'll pass the squares array as my history. And then I'm going to come down here and we'll have our moves UI that will come from the history.map, and we'll have the step squares, so the squares for this step, and the step. So the step is just going to be the index of the array, but that's what we're going to call it, is our step. And then we need to have a description for our step. So if we look at the final version, that's the description right there. So let's get our description. And if our step is the 0 step, 0, then we want to have it say go to game start. Okay, so go to game start. Otherwise, we'll have it say go to move, and then pound, and then the step. Okay, so that's going to be our description for the internals of the button. And then we want to determine whether it's the current step, so we know whether it should be disabled. So we'll say is current step, is the current step. Okay, so we need to maintain that current step state somewhere as well. So I'm going to just put this here, const current step equals 0. All right, and then we'll return an li because this is a list of ordered numbers. And because this is an array that we're going to be rendering, we need to specify a key. So we'll paste the step as the key here. That's the only unique identifier for each one of these. And then we'll put the button, which will have the description as the contents. And then if it's the current step, then we'll have the word current in there. So we'll say is current step, then current. Otherwise, we will just not render anything else. All right, and then we also want this button to be disabled if it is the current step. All right, sweet. So let's go to our board now. We'll render our moves right here as an ordered list, and boom, there we are. Go to game start current. Perfect. So let's go ahead and say, what if we had another array right here, and we say our current step is 1. Boom, go to step 1. Okay, what if we have another element right there? Sweet, we can go to move 2. Awesome. So now we need to actually make these things managed state by React. So we're going to say React use state, and we'll start that out at 0. And this is going to be our current step, and we'll have a set current step. And let's go ahead and wire that up to our button. So when we click on this, we're going to say on click, set current step, to the step that was clicked. Cool. Okay, so now I can click, ta-da. Nice. All right, and then the history needs to be managed state as well. So we'll say React use state, and we'll just initialize this to an array of our squares. And if we save that, now we should only have one element in here. But I made a little mistake, and I want you to figure out what mistake I made here. I'm going to leave this in because I want you to see what I did wrong. So history is assigned to React use state, and squares is a single array where there's only one element in here, so we should only have one button. But actually what history is it is an array of two elements. And so that's what's going on here. I forgot to destructure this. So let's destructure this and have a set history right there. Sweet. We've got that working. All right, so now we're not actually going to be managing the squares at all. We're going to have all of our squares state living inside the history. So let's ditch that squares, and I'm going to just paste that default value in here for our default value of our history. And now, instead of squares, we're going to have a current squares. So I'll have current squares is history at the current step. Okay, so now instead of squares, we'll do current squares for all of these different places. And instead of set squares, we're going to have to do something different. But let me come down here and update that squares as well. And now what are we going to do when the user clicks on a square? Well, there are two things that need to happen. First, we need to update the history to have a new entry for these new squares. And then second, we need to increment the current step. So we're going to need to do things a little bit differently. Instead of just making a copy of the current squares, we also need to make a copy of the new history. There are a couple ways to do this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say new history equals history.slice from index 0 to index current step plus 1. So that's going to give me a new array that's the same as the history, just a copy, a new version, that has all of the things that the previous history had at our current step. So if there are 6 steps and we're on step 3, we'll only get the stuff from 0 to step 3 rather than going all the way to step 6. This squares copy and updating that square value is totally fine. All we need to do now is set the history to be that new history with our squares copy at the tail end of this new array that we're setting the history to. And then we'll need to update our current step to be the very last index of this new history. So we'll say new history.length. All right, sweet. And then when we restart the game, we're going to basically do the initial value of both of these things. So we'll just say set history to an array of arrays there and set current step to 0. All right, sweet. Let's see what happens now. I can click here. Sweet. We've got go to game start, go to move 1. That's disabled. We click here. And now if I want to go back, I click go to move 1. We still have go to move 2 there. I can go to game start. I can start the game over. And now we can just keep on rolling. And everything is working super great. And if we want to store either one of these in local storage, that's totally cool because we have this sweet use local storage state hook that we can replace this with. We'll say use local storage state. Let's give it a fancy local storage key. So tick, tack, toe, step, and initialize that to 0. And then for this one, use local storage state, tick, tack, toe, history. Sweet. So now this is totally in local storage, and I totally had a copy of this game in my local storage already, which is why we've got a full game in here. But if I go to game start, hit refresh, I'm going to still be at this full game that I can go and look and be like, oh yeah, X won because X is awesome. And then O can come around here and be like, no, restart. We refresh and that's all gone. Haha. So this is definitely one that I recommend you play around with, even if you haven't gone through it yourself and built it out yourself. Totally do that. Spend some time playing around with this, make this work, and you'll learn a lot in the process. So let me take you through a quick review of what we've done here. So first off, our board had all of the logic in here for managing the state, and I decided it'd be a little bit easier to manage all of this by pulling some of this UI out into the game. And so we made the board just the squares here, and then put the game controls outside of that board. So we simplified that a little bit and just passed a couple of props here. And then our game rendered out the board. In addition to some of the other UI elements, we added the moves UI, which takes the history, maps over that, and takes each step, renders out a description for the button, determines whether or not we're the current step, and then renders out an LI with a button in it that's disabled if we are the current step, has some special logic in here for what it should render if we are the current step, and then if it's clicked, then we update that current step. And then in here, we're managing that current step, initializing it to 0. And for our history, that's initialized to an array of arrays. So let's go ahead and we'll console.log our history just to make sure that's super clear. We'll restart this and I'll refresh this. We'll go to our console. So this array of arrays, it's just an array where each element in the array is an array itself. And if I add another element to the array by clicking here, now we have an array of 2 arrays where the first one has just a bunch of nulls and the second one has the values that we've entered into here. So we're managing that, and then we get the current squares from which we calculate all of our derived state. And then when a square is selected, we make sure that there's not an element at that current index for our current squares, and there's not already a winner based on our current squares. And then we make a copy of the history at the point where we're at. The reason we do that is if we're at move 2 and then I click here, I don't want to copy moves 3 and 4. I want to just override move 3. So we make a copy of the history from the first index all the way to the current step. And then we make a copy of our squares and update that next value and update the squares at that square index to the next value. We set our history to a new copy of the history with this new squares copy as the end, and then set our current step to the last step here. And then on restart, we update our history to its initial value of an array with a single element that is an array of null, and our current step back to 0. And then just for funsies, we use our use local storage state hook to persist these values into local storage, which just blows my mind how easy it is to do that now.